good morning or good evening. Whenever you are watching this, I hope you are doing well. My name is Katharine, and today I am doing my July reading wrap-up. July was a really good reading month for me. Anytime I read more than 6 books, I think it's a phenomenal reading month. And I read 14 books in the month of July, 7 of which were audiobooks and 7 were physical. Let's get into it so that it doesn't end up being a 50-minute video. The first book that I read in the month of July was American Royals by Katharine McGee. This book is an alternative timeline universe type book. Instead of George Washington becoming the first president of the United States, instead he was the first king of the United States. So we follow the modern descendants of our very first King George. It follows 4 perspectives: Princess Beatrice, who is next in line for the throne and the very first woman to become Queen of the United States, not just Queen Consort. Princess Samantha, which is Beatrice's younger sister, who always tends to think of herself as the spare and not really having any purpose in the royal family. Then we follow Nina, who is a commoner, but she happens to be Princess Samantha's best friend. And lastly, we follow Daphne, who is Prince Jefferson's ex-girlfriend. Prince Jefferson is Samantha's twin brother. Each of these characters have a sort of love interest type thing. This book is filled with everyone falling in love with the wrong person and a lot of mixed signals and miscommunications and forbidden romance. I was kind of comparing it to the TV show Royals and Gossip Girl. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. While I really did enjoy reading it, God, the romances were a lot. I love a good romance, but I was more interested in the actual political intrigue aspect of this book. And also, all the women in this book kind of treat each other like garbage. Samantha tends to be such a garbage friend to Nina, and Nina's a garbage friend to Samantha. And then Daphne literally is just there to tear all the other girls down. I probably will read the second book just because the first book did leave us on such a cliffhanger. The next book that I read was All the Stars and Teeth by Adalyn Grace. This is a fantasy book that follows Amora, who is next in line for the throne of her kingdom. However, when something goes wrong, when she is supposed to demonstrate her magic and prove that she is worthy of ruling, she is forced to flee her home. She ends up teaming up with a pirate who is disguised as a lord, and he has this mysterious path. Also her betrothed, who she doesn't have any romantic feelings for, but she does get along with, and he is an incredible healer. And along the way, they pick up a mermaid who can lure men to their death. And she also senses curses, which is very useful. Amora discovers that there's a plot to destroy the kingdom as they know it, and also she discovers a lot about her magic and her family's magic that has been hidden for years. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I loved a lot of things about this book. The magic system, for one, is so cool and very unique. Basically, the way that this kingdom is set up is there's different islands, and each island has a specific type of magic. So there's elemental magic, there's healing magic, there's curse magic. I thought that concept and the way that this magic came into being and the whole backstory of it, so interesting and so cool. I also did really, really love the characters, and I thought that even the romances came together in a very natural and well-developed way. My problem was the first 2/3, maybe even 3/4 of this book were fast-paced, but also gave you good backstory that came in a natural way. It wasn't super info dumpy. So that was the first 3/4 of the book. And then the writing style just completely changed for that last quarter, and it just felt so rushed that it went from being a 4-star book for me, because until the last 70 pages or so, I was loving this book. And then it just became so rushed that I ended up having to like reread certain sections to figure out where the characters were. I couldn't enjoy the last section of the book, so I ended up giving it 3 stars. The next book that I read is Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. This is a really fascinating book because it is somewhat autobiographical, but also with fantasy elements mixed in. So Echo Brown is a wizard, and she has these magic powers that she's trying to figure out how to use. However, the only person she knows who also has these powers and is a wizard is her mother, who unfortunately is a drug addict and doesn't want to involve herself in Echo's life and learning this magic that they have. The story follows Echo from a very young age. I believe it starts out when she's like 6 or 7 and ends with her being 18. I am going to put a huge trigger warning on this one for drug and alcohol abuse, and there are a couple rape scenes and depictions of sexual violence. So please be mindful when reading this book if you decide to pick it up. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I wasn't too sure when I first started, and I think it's because I listened to it in audiobook format, where there are a lot of like time jumps. So you'll see a scene that is happening last night, and then a scene that is happening right now, and then a scene that is happening 2 years ago, and then a scene that's happening like 2 years in the future. That did get very confusing, especially in like the first half of the book. But I do think it was because I was listening to it in audiobook format. By the time we got to the second half of the book, things were a lot clearer, and I definitely got used to the writing style. Just the writing style in general was very unique, and it took some getting used to. It was a really beautiful read, and the payoff at the end is just absolutely extraordinary, and I loved the like sort of urban fantasy aspect of it, and the magic system itself was super unique and super fascinating. The next book that I read was The Poetex by Elizabeth Acevedo. This book follows Xiomara, who is trying to figure out her identity. She has grown up in a very religious household, but she has a lot of questions and is questioning her faith, and specifically the way that it has been taught it, which is a lot about like blind acceptance, and you follow these certain rules or else you are a terrible person. She has a very complicated relationship with her mother, and while there is some romance and it does focus a little bit on her relationship with her twin brother and shows how differently the two of them are treated, the biggest relationship that is shown is her relationship with her mom. Xiomara loves to write poetry, and she discovers slam poetry, and she wants to perform and write these poems to express what it is like to be her growing up in this world. The book itself is written in verse form, which is absolutely beautiful and lends itself to the narrative so wonderfully. I, of course, gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I just absolutely fell in love with it, and I fell in love with Elizabeth Acevedo's writing. I can't believe it took me this long to finally read it. It's been on my TBR for like forever. Up next, I read They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. This is a futuristic contemporary where people know specifically what day they are going to die, and they get a phone call around midnight that tells them that this is their last day. This story follows Matteo and Rufus, who both get the phone call at the beginning of the story. So you know that they are going to both die by the end of the book, but you don't know how. Matteo and Rufus don't know each other, but they end up connecting through this app called the Last Friend app, and it's a way for people to have one last friend and one last connection before they die. This book is so beautiful. First of all, you have the character of Matteo, who is terrified of going anywhere, and he has realized that this is his last day and he's never really truly learned how to live. And then you have Rufus, who has learned how to live, but he's made a lot of like bad choices in his life, and he oftentimes lets his temper get the best of him. Their relationship that develops throughout the book is so beautiful, and the way that they blend their two friend groups together is so fun too. I gave this book 4.5 stars. The only reason I didn't give it like that last 0.5 was because I just had some questions about the whole like process of how the people know they're going to die that day. But overall, the book is really beautiful. If you don't like books that don't have happy endings, maybe don't read this one. Not to spoil anything, but the title is They Both Die at the End. So the next 7 books that I read as part of the reading rush. So I managed to read all 7 books in 7 days. By some miracle. Honestly, still don't really believe that happened, but here we are. So the first book that I finished was The Bone Houses by Emily Lloyd-Jones. This book follows Adalyn, I still don't really know how to pronounce her name, but alas, here we are, who is a gravedigger. But their mother died and her father disappeared a while ago. So it has fallen to her and her 2 siblings to keep up the grave digging business. Now, the reason why their job is so important is because the dead don't always stay dead. Normally, if the dead come back to life, they stay in the forest. It only happens in the forest. However, recently, more and more of these bone houses, which are what the zombies are called, have started wandering into the town. Rin ends up taking this epic quest to try and break a curse with the help of a map maker with a mysterious past named Ellis. I've realized in all of my reading vlogs I called him Elias. His name isn't Elias, it's Ellis. I love Emily Lloyd-Jones's writing. I absolutely adore her other book, The Hearts We Sold, as well. I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. I thought that, first of all, the storyline was very unique, and while Rin did have a little bit of the not like other girls aspect, she never really shamed anyone. Rin and Ellis's relationship developed really beautifully and really naturally. There is a little bit of that like instant connection, but I wouldn't call it insta-love. And I definitely thought that the whole like magic system kind of lore that goes around this town and the bone houses was just super fascinating. The next book that I read was Stay Gold by Tobly McSmith. This book follows Pony, who is a trans boy who has just transferred into a new school for his senior year. He sees this as an opportunity as having a fresh start where nobody knows him as the trans boy, just as a boy. However, things do get a little complicated when he meets Georgia, who is a cheerleader. Georgia is beginning to realize that there may be more to life than just cheerleading, and she really enjoys writing and wants to become a journalist. However, it is looked down upon, I guess, for cheerleaders to have other interests. There's a lot of like, you have to fit the status quo in this book. Let me preface me talking about this by saying I am a cis woman. I think that there definitely needs to be more like trans representation in books, especially like contemporaries that aren't all like doom and gloom. This wasn't one of those. It was very much marketed like it was a fun like contemporary that does have like some like hard elements, but I'm gonna put a huge major trigger warning on this because there is a lot of misgendering, there is abuse, there is one instance that involves Pony being called by his dead name. I ended up giving this 2 stars. A lot of the issues that I had were things that just made me really uncomfortable, not because the main character was trans, but because of the way that he was treated. I felt like none of the characters actually redeemed themselves. You have Pony's best friend who is constantly pushing him to come out at his school, and Pony does not feel safe to come out. First of all, he's in a school in a small town of Texas, but his friend is constantly pushing him and shaming him for not wanting to come out. Also, Georgia has a huge issue with Pony being trans. I'm sorry, this is going to be a little spoilery, but I think people should know. She says that it's a problem, and then she doesn't really ever apologize to Pony for the transphobic things that she says to him. And then also, Pony isn't really a great guy, because even before Georgia knows that he's trans, she doesn't want to get into a relationship, and she wants to focus on like herself and her own aspirations. Pony has some like serious like, oh, I got put in the friend zone, but I'm just gonna keep on pursuing this girl. The reason I did give it 2 stars, it is an own voices book, which is important. And the writing style itself was really beautiful. One thing that I did love about it was anytime someone affirmed Pony's gender, even just casually like saying, hey man, thanks for doing that, it would emphasize the word man. And I thought that was really cool, because it's not something that I would ever think about. And so reading that, it's like, oh yes, of course someone who is having a lot of like body dysmorphia and gender dysmorphia, those simple words, those simple phrases are powerful. I just think that the book wasn't marketed in a way that prepared me for what it was about, and I just didn't think that the characters really went through good development. The next book that I read was Witchy by Ariel, Slamet, Ries. This is a graphic novel. It takes place in a world where people's powers are connected to how long their hair is. So the longer hair you have, the more powerful you have. However, if your hair is too long, then you can be deemed too powerful and dangerous, and therefore be burned. You're executed, you're killed. Our main character, Nynaeve, I believe is how their name is pronounced. Her father was killed when she was young because of how long his hair was. So she ends up trying to hide and conceal how long her hair is as a way to avoid being drafted into the army. It's a really cool fantasy with a really, really interesting magic system. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. It was really good, really enjoyable, a fun, fast graphic novel to read. The next book that I read was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. If you don't know what Pride and Prejudice is about, it follows Lizzie Bennet and her sisters Jane, Lydia, Kitty, and Mary. They all have to kind of find husbands because they're women, and if they don't, they lose their land and are going to be poor and destitute. When the rich and handsome Mr. Bingley moves into a nearby manor house over at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet sees this as an opportunity for one of her daughters to be married at last. We also have Mr. Darcy. I just love Mr. Darcy so much, who is Mr. Bingley's broody, proud friend who is also very rich. And Lizzie is not attracted to him at all, or is she? This is like the OG enemies to lovers. It's so good. I went into it thinking this will probably end up being like a 3-star book. Like I think, you know, yes, everyone loves Pride and Prejudice, and it's a classic, but like, I feel like so many classics don't hold up over time. This one like actually holds up really well. Lizzie's character is not perfect by any means. The whole reason it's called Pride and Prejudice is Pride is referring to Mr. Darcy and Prejudice is referring to Lizzie. She has the I'm not like other girls syndrome, but it calls her out on it. And at one point, one of the characters even says, oh, Lizzie Bennet, she's one of those girls who puts down people of her own sex to try and make herself seem more appealing. Like, that's a thing that Jane Austen wrote in like the 1800s whenever this was written. And also, I feel like people downplay how actually like funny it is. There's so many moments where I like had to stop because it was like, oh shit, that's hilarious. It has a very dry sense of humor, which I absolutely love. There's so much banter back and forth. And I was reminded how much I love this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. No shame. This is one of those classics that definitely holds up. and now I just need to read all of Jane Austen's books. The next book that I read was My Calamity Jane by the Lady Janies. This book follows Annie Oakley, Calamity Jane, and Frank Butler. It is a historical fiction with werewolves. Basically, Wild Bill's Wild West show is a cover for them to hunt werewolves. They are trying to hunt down the alpha and run into a lot of problems along the way. It is a funny, satirical book. The characters are just so fun. And if you do like historical fiction and want to know more about like the Wild West, which I feel like isn't a like very popular historical fiction timeline to cover, this is really, really good. There's fun references to Annie Get Your Gun, the musical, which I appreciated. Overall, it's just a really cool, interesting book, and I ended up giving it 4 out of 4 stars. The next book that I read was Under the Tuscan Sun by Frances Mayes. This book is a memoir that follows Frances. They end up buying a rundown villa in a town in Tuscany, and it is their entire process of trying to fix up this town and them like exploring Italian culture, and a beautiful book. It very much is written almost like it's her diary, and it goes into great detail about, okay, here's how you build a brick wall. I now know more about restoring a old villa and also Italian food than I ever thought I would know. Basically, the book made me want to run away and buy an old villa and never look back at the United States again, because we're a mess. But it was really beautiful. There was like a full chapter that was just recipes. I ended up giving it 3 stars just because there wasn't like an actual storyline per se. Like, the storyline was them fixing this house, and it talked about like the problems that they had and the conflicts and the like trying to communicate and all that, but there wasn't like an actual like through storyline. And also there just were times where I'm like, do I really need to know about your painting process in this much detail? The last book I read for the reading rush was Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. This book, like her other book, is written also in verse form. It follows 2 girls, Camino, who lives in the Dominican Republic, and Yahira, who lives in New York City. They discover that they share the same dad after he dies in a plane crash. It is such an interesting book that talks about their cultures and their relationship and how they discover suddenly they have a sister and their dad had this whole other life that they didn't know about. It is so beautifully written, and again, I just love the writing style of Elizabeth Acevedo in this like verse format. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It's amazing. It's a great book. Pick it up. If you haven't picked it up already, what are you waiting for? Do it. The next book that I read was 10 Things I Hate About Pinky by Sandhya Menon. This is the 3rd and I believe final book in the Dimple and Rishi trilogy. All these books take place in the same universe. However, like the side character of the last book is the main character of the next book, if that makes sense. It's really cool because it means that all the characters in the past books are like really well developed and have their own sort of life and storyline, which tends to be a problem in contemporary books. So in this one, Pinky is kind of known as the rebel child. Her mom and dad are like high-level lawyers and they are all about rule following, but she is an activist and she has crazy colors in her hair, and she has had a record of having just like really terrible boyfriends. And then we have Samir, who is very like meticulous. Everything has to be in order. He himself wants to be a lawyer, and he actually was supposed to go on an internship for a lawyer in Washington, D.C. that ends up falling through. Pinky ends up inviting Samir to their summer vacation lake house to be her like fake boyfriend, to show her parents that, hey, look, I can do something right. Look at this guy, he's perfect. So there's the fake dating with the enemies to lovers aspect because Pinky and Samir do not get along. It's a really, really, really cute story. I ended up giving it like 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's really adorable and it's a really light, fluffy read. The last and final book that I read in July, oh my gosh, we're finally here, was Roaring by Lindsey Duga. This book was provided to me through NetGalley by Untitled Publishing to read and give my honest review, and it is coming out, I believe, the day this video is published. August 3rd is when the publication date is. So thank you so much, Untitled Publishing, for the book. Roaring is set in 1929 and takes place in an alternative universe where monsters exist. Basically, mobs and other like high-level people, high-powered people, have begun genetically modifying humans and putting monster parts on them. So mythological creatures such as like a manticore or a basilisk or a gorgon, and they use these people as weapons for their mob. This story follows Colt Clemens, who is an agent for the Bureau of Investigations, and he is tasked to hunting down monsters. He is the only person who can resist the siren's song. However, the last siren disappeared years ago until suddenly she makes an appearance. Eris hasn't spoken a word for years because she knows that her voice is more than just a voice. It is a weapon that people can take advantage of and can accidentally get people hurt without her meaning to. I gave this book 3 stars. The concept is so cool to have the 1920s vibe of the story, which I absolutely love. 1920s is one of my like favorite time periods for a story to be set. So you get the 1920s vibe with the like mythological aspect on top of it. It creates such like high stakes for the characters because it's like not only are they being chased by mobsters, but these mobsters also could like kill you with a single look because they're part basilisk. It is constantly moving from one thing to the next. The biggest like downside of the fact that it was like so action-packed was I felt like there just wasn't enough character development. Eris starts to like stand up for herself in the end, but like honestly, you show me the characters from point A to point B at the end of the story and they haven't changed that much. And that also affects the sort of romance aspect of it. We had this like perfect setup for like a sort of enemies to lovers, lots of tension happening because you have a monster hunter and a monster that end up teaming up together, but it didn't translate very well. And there was just a ton of info dumping. I felt like for the entire like first half of the book, people were just constantly just explaining things. I'm like, you don't have to explain it, just show me and I'll understand. It was a really, really fun read. I did enjoy it. I just wanted so much more out of the characters. Okay, we finally reached the end. My voice is going because I just talked for like an hour. Thank you so much for watching if you made it all the way to the end. Let me know what your favorite book of July was and if there is a book that you are particularly excited to read in August. I make new videos every Monday and Thursday, so be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of them. And if you liked this video, be sure to give it a big thumbs up. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and until next time, bye!